Hi, I'm Aniyia Williams, and I am the lead of the Tech We Want, which is taking a collective approach to building infrastructure and tech products and services that center human thriving and responsible innovation. Today, I am joined by four amazing women. We're going to talk about tools for a new economy and what role we're all playing in it. I'm joined by Shu Mac Cormac, Coraline Ada Ehmke, Christie Pitts, and Shu Dar Yao. I would love to have everybody just quickly go around and give a quick, brief description of who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Shu Mac Cormac. I'm a partner at Morrison & Foerster, and I believe that I'm here, and I'm very excited to be here because I focus on scaffolding. So if you understand that philanthropic capital is less than 0.25% of the capital markets, how do we aggregate capital, deploy capital, and then restructure the underlying corporate form in the mainstream capital market so that you can have positive impact?
I'm Coraline Ada Ehmke. I am the founder and executive director of the Organization for Ethical Source. I actually got my start with a 26-year career as a software engineer, and I'm here representing the technology that powers the kind of innovation that we're talking about here, which is open source. 87% of all companies in the world use open source in their products, and it literally powers the internet. So it's a force for good and a force for change in the technology world.
Hi, I'm Christie Pitts, and I'm a venture capitalist. I was formerly at Backstage Capital, where we invested and are continuing to invest in companies led by women, people of color, and LGBTQ founders, over 200 companies to date. I'm also the co-founder of a campaign called VCs for Repro, which is a coalition of more than 120 venture capital firms who spoke out about criminalizing abortion as a violation of human rights and as anti-innovation.
I'm thrilled to be here. My name is Shu Dar Yao. I am the founder and managing partner of Lucid Capitalism. We are an all-women advisory boutique focused on helping the largest VC funds think more intentionally about their climate and social implications in their portfolios and in their fund structures. It's a fun bit of work that I come to after 2 decades as both an investor on the sell side and on the buy side across a few different asset classes. And we could talk a little bit more about why venture capital is such an interesting part of this question.
Thank you. All right, so we've got a little bit of lay of the land here. I feel like I want to just jump right into a conversation that defines the problem space a little bit. So I would love, and people can just, jump in here, but I would love to hear folks offer a perspective on what you feel like the current limitations are of what we have today, both in terms of financing or other kinds of frameworks, tools, especially Coraline, open source, which does play such an important role. What do we think is holding us back from having a more inclusive and equitable tech ecosystem? I'll start with you, Shu Dar.
I'm happy to share that in prep, Sue and I were chatting about what the funding environment looks like writ large right now. And I think I was a little too young to appreciate what it was like in 2001 or 2008. But my understanding is that this is probably the toughest fundraising environment that we've had in a few decades here, at least in Silicon Valley. I think there's something really interesting to be said about what happens when the Fed basically stops quantitative easing. You sort of see that trickling through the entire economy. And it's taken a bit of time, but starting last March, we've basically seen the entire fundraising environment kind of pull back. Yeah. There were lots of really great commitments made by institutional investors, by fund of funds to really support emerging BIPOC GPs after George Floyd was murdered. And a lot of that has not come to fruition. So that's sort of the backdrop for what I see happening. You also had the 2021 sort of like peak in valuations and multiples. And so there's a lot of social enterprises, a lot of climate tech companies that raise and valued at very tough numbers and are going to have to be making very difficult decisions while their GPs are also similarly cutting back, right? So
I also want to, sorry to cut you off here, I want to jump in because I realized that Shu Dar in her infinite brilliance is using some terms that some folks may or may not know. Do you mind explaining very quickly what a GP is and what that relationship is to what you're describing?
Sure. It feels silly doing this when there's a lawyer here who literally makes her trade on this. But limited partners are the institutional investors, foundations, pension funds, university endowments who actually share their capital with general partners and they have no liability or very limited liability to the way that those Sandhill Road giants actually allocate the capital. Those Sandhill Road giants then look for unicorns, decacorns. Sometimes they're social enterprises. Sometimes they're not. They're kind of for-profit regular businesses. And so that structure of LP, GP, and then portfolio company is an important one to understand, sort of see what the waterfall of capital is. But I'd love to defer to Susan McCormack to add any footnotes that I've missed.
Anything you would add, Suze?
Well, I was actually going to take what you said in terms of the funding ecosystem being a current challenge. From my perspective, you have the VCs, the investors, you have sort of Mark Andreessen's manifesto. You've got to, focus on acceleration of growth kind of at almost all costs. And what I find really frustrating and a challenge is that there is a belief, I refer to what I do as the scaffolding. It's the scaffolding around the movement of money, the scaffolding around a partnership, around the LPs, the scaffolding around how they deploy capital, and the scaffolding around companies. And really what we have is a presumption that even if you're incredibly innovative with your technology and you can use open source, you can use all of the technology and you have fabulous people, everybody still uses the same scaffolding. And that scaffolding, because it's just like it's around a building, yields the same results. And by definition, those results do not consider all of the stakeholders other than shareholders that are impacted by what you're doing. And so my frustration, one of the reasons I've been so honored to get to know the tech we want is you don't have to use that scaffolding. There are actually very responsible ways to build and grow a company, to organize as a GP or an asset manager, as an LP that work and that allow you, encourage or require you to consider other factors other than just shareholders and pure bottom line and pure growth. And so making sure that we don't keep having the Y Combinator pumping out the companies that have the same scaffolding, which end up destroying democracy, I would think would be a priority.
I think it's also helpful to level set and maybe set some definitions or assumptions around the ecosystem that we're talking about.
Yeah, let's go.
So in venture capital, if those are not familiar with it, one might assume that there is some level of an equal playing field. And in reality, it's very skewed. So the majority of investors, a vast majority of investors in venture capital, and venture capital being a subset of private equity, are white male investors. And it's been said that 91% of check writers at venture capital firms are white men. And so that means that sub 10% of check writers are women. And there's well-established data that shows that the more diverse an investing team is, the more diverse the teams are that are funded. And that matters because diverse teams go on to hire and grow diverse companies. And so in the absence of diversity, what we have now is a homogenous system where sub 3% of capital goes to women founders or companies solely run by women. And sub 1% of capital goes to Black women and women of color founders. And what that means ultimately is that some people have access to capital and others do not. And therefore, some people have a voice and ability to build and profit from technology, and others are excluded from that. And then that contributes to the inequalities that we see in society.
Okay, so if I'm trying to summarize here a little bit of what all three of you are saying, there's this piece of it where, to speak to this term of scaffolding that Suze is using, it's not fit for the purpose of people who are either trying to prioritize social goals alongside their financial goals. And that's also very homogenous in a way where there's not a lot of inclusive participation, which means that we are not allowing businesses, not only business that maybe don't know what kind of growth trajectory they're going to end up having, or not going to be a $1 billion company, but still working on great solutions. Also people that are coming from different backgrounds, have different perspectives, have access to different networks and different markets and different opportunities, are not even really getting a shot to try their hand at building something and solving a problem.
Right.
Yes. Okay. I want to bring Coraline here in, and I feel like I would love for you to talk about this role that that open source plays in this big picture, And I would also just love for you to even touch on a little bit what you're doing at OES to try to combat some of these challenges.
Sure thing. I've heard some of you talk about homogeneity and the difficulties in being a marginalized person trying to move in this world. And I can say that that same thing is reflected in the way the tech itself is built as well. In the open source world, there's this famous XKCD cartoon where you have the entire infrastructure of the internet, and there's this one little piece here that's maintained by a guy in Bozeman, Montana. And so we have the same problem with lack of diversity in engineering on the engineering side, and the work that OES does with instruments like Contributor Covenant and other things we're doing is to try and open the door to more folks who are from the marginalized backgrounds to come and have a part in the technology that we're building, because technology that is made primarily by 25-year-old white dudes in Silicon Valley best serves 25-year-old white dudes in Silicon Valley. And it's time that we have some different perspectives in the way that, not only the way the tech is built, but for whom and why.
Can I draw a through line to this, which I find really interesting?
Yes.
I'm sure that a number of us are familiar with the work of Dr. Timnit Gebru and Dr. Joy Buolamwini. And I find it really interesting that even after this Rolling Stone article that is basically put into, I think, mainstream positioning, that AI can't become ethical by virtue of big tech companies having trust and safety at the very latest stage, but it actually is all about who's in the room, who's on the cap table very early on. Neither of these women were in a position where they could be an early angel investor. And I think that's one of the reasons why you sort of see big tech developing into what it is now and into a bit more of Susa's domain, right? Why do we have so many big tech companies with dual class voting shares where share B has 10x voting rights, or all of the voting rights? And this notion that these companies are going to have any thoughtfulness around positive or negative externalities to their beneficiaries or their customers, if you've already structured out the ability for anyone to have any rights on the table. So it's really, for me, an interesting moment to have that through line and say, hey, well, what happened to Ellen Powell at Kleiner Perkins? What's going on these days around the early capital all the way to the whistleblower or the woman who was fired or, the XYZ externality of, call it, bad tech?
So Sudar's point also reminds me of another thing that I feel like comes up a lot in conversations that I'm a part of, which is fiduciary duty. And I'm looking at you, Suz, because I'm like, I would love for you to share a little bit about I don't know, the challenges that present itself with us kind of trying to move into any kind of new economic model when someone evokes I feel like it's like Voldemort that enters the room. It's like fiduciary duty. Yes, exactly.
I feel a bit like Pavlov's dog. Somebody says fiduciary duty, so I'm like, oh, we got to tackle it. We got to, oh, yeah. But I mean, just the one interesting thing, I don't work very much with early stage companies, but one of the things I've noticed just in terms of sort of good or bad tech, usually your founder doesn't, even if he's a 25-year-old male, doesn't set out to destroy democracy or to come up with an AI that ensures that people who are black and brown can't get mortgages. I mean, it's usually not the intent. Right. The issue is, I think it's what we're all saying, that you have a scaffolding with the capital, who's writing the checks, the capital employee, who's developing the tech, who's making the decisions, which yield certain results. And you're exactly right. It is that those people believe they have a fiduciary duty to, and the question is to whom? Mm-hmm. So if you are, exactly. Let's go back to your language, the limited partners, or if you use permanent capital, the shareholders, the folks, the asset owners, the people that own and are responsible for their capital, they have a fiduciary duty to the folks for whom they are holding that capital. So if they are really wealthy individuals, it's just themselves. Most of these are pension funds. So they are holding that capital in trust and have a fiduciary duty to the teachers, the firemen, the people that they are managing that money for. And when you talk about we need to consider stakeholders other than shareholders, you're going to teachers. Let's just take, an example. You're going to teachers that have a very low salary. They're putting their money in a pension so that they can actually have something when they retire. And so that is what is driving those asset owners, and then it filters down to the asset managers, believe they have a fiduciary duty, first and foremost, to make sure that that teacher gets the highest return. And now you're coming and saying, well, wait a second, you need to consider these things other than higher returns. And there are a couple interesting things at play. Number one, because of the homogeneity of the ecosystem, I don't think there's a full understanding that, in fact, inclusion of diversity does yield better returns. That's first and foremost. But second, I do think we have to challenge the drive for alpha for any individual company. So if each individual company is just maximizing profitability, especially on things like climate change, things are going to get worse and worse and worse. So it's the classic kind of prisoner's dilemma. That in fact, for asset owners, let's just take my example of the pension fund holding funding for teachers, those returns are more based on GDP than they are individual company performance. And so I think we have to start expanding the view of fiduciary duties, and we can do it. I mean, they should be thinking about returns because they're holding your retirement funding, but they need to be thinking more broadly and long-term. If I'm 25 and a teacher, I'm putting it in, what is going to yield the best returns? And I think not just diversity, but things like climate have to be baked in and have to be part of the conversation. Then you have the fiduciary duty, the duties of the asset owners, the asset managers to the asset owners, your GP to the asset owners. Interestingly, most of these funds are structured to eliminate those duties altogether.
Exactly.
They have no duties. So that is all by contract. And so what that means on the positive side is that there's no reason that the asset managers, the GPs, the people who are running these huge funds can't put all of these considerations. They can enter into an agreement with their LPs. And then at the company level, there's a slightly different fiduciary duty where you have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders, to the owners, including the VCs. But that's where there are now new models like the Public Benefit Corporation in Delaware, where you can actually have dual fiduciary duties, number one. And fiduciary duties does not mean that, Google has to focus on shareholder value at all time. All of the moonshots from Google X and otherwise, you can focus on many, many other things that don't specifically tie to shareholder value, which means you can focus on diversity. You can focus on, even with a normal corporation, you can focus on climate. You can focus on these things and not be in breach of your fiduciary duty. So sorry for breaking it down, but I think
I love that.
You have to think about it at each, and I love how Shu Dar, it's each step of the capital markets.
So I feel like I wanna basically say that Sue, you're saying that fiduciary duty doesn't have to just mean maximizing financial returns, that there's much more that could and should be considered in that big term of fiduciary duty, which actually I think is a really great segue too into, I want to kind of get a little bit into what the four of you are respectively doing that is either building an alternative or, challenging what these things are that we've been talking about. I feel like just to Suze's last point, Shu Dar, I want to look at you because I know that you have been working both at the LP level and at the GP level to try to get people to prioritize more when they think about their fiduciary duty.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I answer that question, I just want to highlight, and this is to your point, Coraline, I think there's something very interesting in parallel between how we're trying to go upstream, or at least my work is about going upstream to LPs to try and communicate to them the power that they have. And to Suze's point, how they, through contracts or through limited partner agreements and various documents, can exert different pressures further down the line. Because to the tech infrastructure world, because so much of technology is actually built on open source data, or even let's just say publicly scrapable data, OpenAI, for example, and how ChatGPT-3 is built, we're talking about a systems level problem, right? So my work is really focused on trying to communicate to different parts of this waterfall what the costs are of their choices. It's a lot of carrots, it's a lot of sticks. Sometimes it's, hey, chief marketing officer of $30 billion VC fund, if you do this, you're going to have a really easy time fundraising. your LPs are going to re-up and be big anchors, and they're going to be really excited to co-investments with you, to the LPs, it's, hey, how did FTX go again? Right?
Yes.
Can you remind me a little bit about what happens when you kind of look away during AGM season and you don't really think about what's happening at the portfolio level? Do you end up having defense tech that you're proud of hearing about, right? Do you end up sitting alongside a national government that for CFIUS reasons you're feeling uncomfortable about? So I play with different, call it very dynamic levers with each of these different ecosystem players. And sort of to Coraline's point, eventually you kind of have to get to where does this all flow from? And my finding after being, in a couple different roles within finance is it's all about the institutional investors and about empowering them to not only feel educated, but to feel excited enough to take a stand and say, hey, I'd like to see what this looks like. I know the SEC just changed it, but maybe I would like to have a side letter to understand a little bit more about how open source information is being used in my portfolio companies. Because it's only through slowly empowering that part of the ecosystem that I think we're going to see the level of change that we need, which is a systems level change. I wish I could go to the portfolio level. I'm really excited to hear what it looks like from an operator perspective. But just given the Powerball nature of how many of these companies are frankly not going to survive to their next funding round, I'm focusing on upstream.
Yeah. Heard. And I think the other thing I want to say about my own personal perspective is that I think that there are things, there are instances, there are companies where venture capital is a useful tool. I just think that that is a very, very small, much, much smaller number of businesses than we sort of operate in this system. So I want to kick it to you, Christie, because I know that you have been in the investor seat, and I would love to hear more of your perspective, especially because you have always prioritized more than just the returns, but have been looking at, more as a part of that bottom line. Your approach, what is giving you hope and inspiration? What do you feel like is working?
What is giving me hope and inspiration? Okay, so I think that in terms of investing in founders, that kind of work is so energizing because founders really believe in a vision where what they're bringing to market will change the world. And to your point that you made earlier, I won't say all founders, but the majority are not starting with poor intentions and starting with the hope of marginalizing or further marginalizing or contributing to inequality or the ills that we have. I like what you said about working upstream. And I just want to call out that the tech we want does not exist in a vacuum where tech is separate from society. And that's actually one of the challenges that I see is that when people are looking, for example, if a founder is looking to start a company and solve a problem, is that problem a societal problem? Or is it a technological problem? That matters quite a bit because, for example, if we think about founders, if we think about some of the problems being housing opportunities, right? And how our issues in the tech ecosystem contribute to a lack of housing. Does it make sense then for us to try to privatize the solution and for investors to come in like myself and other investors to come in and then profit from that solution? So I just wanted to open a more conversation about how the role tech plays in greater society and build on what you said earlier. But also to the question that you asked, I think that what's really interesting is that when you can, at a micro level, so changing from the macro to the micro, when you can invest in, as I have, into founders that are looking at a problem from a different perspective and building something that does have an impact at scale, that really matters. And I don't know if any of y'all have heard of this parable of the man walking along the seaside and throwing starfish back into the ocean. But is all these starfish have washed up onto the beach. And so he's walking along, picking up starfish and throwing them back in. And somebody walks over and says, well, you threw a few in, but there's thousands and thousands on this beach. And he says, well, it matters for that one. And so I think that's something else that we can't forget in this conversation is that at a macro level for those teachers, that one teacher, for example, it can make a huge difference in his family's wealth and generational wealth to come. And then that's the micro level. But then at the macro level, what's happening when we consider fiduciary duty and the fact that diversity isn't typically considered in allocation processes. And data shows that that actually leads to worse outcomes for financial performance.
And I would like, I'm hearing a lot about intentionality. And in the social justice world, and especially in the tax social justice world, we have an expression that intent is not magical. We really need to be looking at the impact of these things. And you spoke about fiduciary duty, and you spoke about how every technology has to be considered within a societal context. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But beyond fiduciary duty, it doesn't matter if the retirement fund for that teacher performs really well if the ocean is on fire.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter if that's leading to broader social problems. So I think one of the problems we have is not just a relationship between a company and a VC, but a relationship between a company and greater society. And we don't have, as far as I know, any instruments in place that reinforce or that incentivize giving a damn about the impact that these companies have on the broader world. You mentioned AI. AI is an environmental disaster. And what we're getting for that is deepfakes. What we're getting for that is stealing intellectual property. I think we need to slow down and think about the impact of the technologies that we're developing rather than jumping on bandwagons. And I know jumping on bandwagons makes a lot of investors very, very happy, but I think that's doing so much damage to our society and to our world that we have to start considering those things.
And if I can, just the one solution to that issue. So when I got into corporate form and structuring and governance 20-something years ago with Ovidia,
Welcome back.
you have your for-profits on one side and your nonprofits on the other. And nonprofits are fine. They just, if you look at the world's ills and philanthropic capital, people are, setting up $10 billion funds and things are getting worse and worse and worse. So there is a negative correlation between philanthropic capital right now for a whole bunch of reasons and the world's problems. I have more hope in the for-profit world moving, and the one viable solution that can be used at scale is that I mentioned it earlier, the Delaware Public Benefit Corporation. So what the Delaware PBC, and it's based on the California SBC, it is different from the Benefit Corporation, and a B Corp is just a certification. So I just had to give you that public service announcement because everybody gets them mixed up. But as a company that is developing tech, if you set up as a public benefit corporation, you can have two fiduciary duties. So a normal corporation can consider all these factors. They just don't, and they have a ton of incentives to be driving for shareholder returns that yields a lot of these issues. The public benefit corporation, you have a fiduciary duty, and you must focus on that fiduciary duty. And then the question is, how will that be used? Right now, most of the public benefit corporations have a public benefit that is an extension of what they do to make money. So, for example, the first publicly traded PBC was in the business of private education. Their mission was education. But it doesn't have to be the case. You can have a company with a public benefit where with a public benefit of climate, where they're in energy generation. What that actually does is any shareholder can sue them if they're not focusing on climate, and it protects them if, for example, they're a big energy company and they have to invest heavily in an energy transition and their stock price drops. So I like the fact that it has been tested. It has not been used as much as it should be to address your issue. I completely agree. But it is a tool. And another tool that could work at scale is, let's just take our teachers fund, and they're investing in these managers that are paying themselves hundreds of millions of dollars in the form of carry that is taxed at capital gains.
Yeah.
Carry is the number one cause of inequality in this country, bar none. So what if you, as some folks that I can't name do, you say, okay, we will invest in you as an asset owner if a portion of that carry goes back into a bonus pool for the teachers. So let's actually start providing some incentives to take some of the money on money. And it is making money on money that is there's no fiduciary duty to pay somebody a couple $100 million in carry. So restructuring, that's just one example, restructuring that.
Can I ask you a question? And this is something that I always pops into my mind right away when I hear something like that, is instead of creating, for example, like an earmarked bonus pool for teachers, what if we just taxed carry like an income tax and used...
So
it's a great question. Or like,
let me address that.
Okay.
So I have always been on the conservative end of the spectrum. One of the reasons was, I don't trust government on things like climate. I've seen government regulate, and government regulation, this needs to be a change in the capital market structure, not just government regulation. And that's why
climate needs to be a change in the capital market structure.
A lot of DEI, a lot of these things. If we leave it to the legislators, we're going to go to the lowest common denominator. It's not going to affect. I think we need wholesale systems change, not just regulation. I actually think we need some regulation as well.
What kind of regulation?
I don't trust our government to at any point. I mean, you almost had a tax on carry, and then you have one senator. Right now, you have a government that can't even keep itself open.
I mean, sure.
We are going to turn, and we don't have another 10 or 20 years to wait to solve climate and inequality. And I completely agree with Coraline, who's I've just met. I'm like, we are looking at technology that has the ability to destroy the planet. And that scares the shit out of me. Am I allowed to say shit? Anyway, and so how do we need to act more quickly, and I think we have to act more quickly than government So yes, should carry be taxed? 100%. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
By the time we actually get that done, we'll already be halfway
we're gonna be dead
in the hand
yes.
basket.
So this is why I love, let's work with the technology. Let's work with changing the structure around the development of tech and the open source. I'm throwing it back to you.
Yeah.
And let's work on the scaffolding, and let's work on the financing, and let's work on, changing the asset owners so they take some. They're not just purely looking at returns. They are factoring this in, and when they're evaluating where they're going to put their capital.
Okay, I am very excited by this conversation right now. I want to try to dig into two things that are going to come from the two of you. I'm like, oh, this is fun. Okay, so one, because I feel like I want to hear, Suze, from you about just actually the thing that's in my mind, I'm thinking about the Patagonia Purpose Trust, especially because you're talking about climate, and I know that that's something that is some of your handiwork. I would love for us to kind of give people a little bit of a taste of here's an example of something that exists that is an example of what we're talking about. And I think about this term quadruple bottom line, where we're thinking about not only the shareholders, but we're thinking about workers, we're thinking about society, we're thinking about the planet. And then I think also, Coraline, because this is something that can move faster than government regulation, what you're doing at OES with, the Hippocratic license, for example, on putting that on open source code. I would love for you to talk about that too. So let's start with Coraline.
I feel like what we need is systems of accountability and systems of incentivizing corporations to do the right thing, because corporations aren't going to do the right thing because it's the right thing, at least not in my experience. So, like I mentioned, open source powers 87% of the internet of businesses, and is the foundation on which the internet is built. And with traditional open source licenses, it has become an exploitative kind of situation. The expression that we always had was free as in speech, not free as in beer. And I think it's more of free as in labor. So what my organization and I'm trying to do is change that calculus. So businesses that are able to use open source are able to go to market quickly. They're able to compete quickly, get to a point where they have an MVP very quickly. And under permissive technology licenses, they are not beholden to anyone for the way they operate and the way they use the technology. The license that I created through my organization, the Organization for Ethical Source, called the Hippocratic license, actually ensures that in order to use the software, you are accountable to ethical restrictions. And the Hippocratic license is modular, so we allow a creator community, a technology creator community, to choose the aspects of ethics. It could be climate, it could be labor rights, it could be any number of things that they want to ensure that companies that adopt their technologies have to follow. And we've actually created a right to remedy, I believe is the expression, where if if the license is misused and an ethical clause is violated, those who are impacted by that actually have a right to sue the company that adopted that technology for violation of the license. So I think things like that are ways that we start to create systems of accountability for the way the technology is being used. Because those of us who are creating technology don't want it to be used to set the ocean on fire, but we have no say in how what we're building is used. And that is a missing component, I think, in the ethical framework that is part of the tech we want.
I can actually just build on that, because if you ask me, so I talked about the one solution for companies being a PBC with the dual fiduciary duties. Another that we've been doing for years is a licensing model. So if you were a founder, you could have some valuable IP, could be the trademark, could be open source, that is licensed in to the company for use, and that license has a mission lock. So we've done it where the license just terminates if you deviate from the mission. And I don't like the complicated Valley standard of 16 pages on arbitration to fight it. I like a very simple, like you agree up front that Shu Dar is going to be the arbiter, and if, to determine whether mission has been broken, or, the head of the ethics department at Columbia, whatever it is, one person, and they make the determination if it's violated. And we've done that with licenses. So it's an all or nothing, or you can actually create, I love Coraline's, the economic penalties, which is where, if you start straying a little bit, you start paying higher license fees, or you have to pay fees. It's no longer, free in terms of use. So the licensing is a really valuable. You asked me about the Perpetual Purpose Trust, and I'll just, Shu Dar, mention the dual class stock. I still like dual class stock, but as a founder, instead of giving yourself 10 times voting power, and the issue with concentrating that in one person is they just, what we're talking about, they don't have diversity of perspectives. And especially in the Valley, they're surrounded by white men who look like them and think like them. Quite frankly, in my world, all of the lawyers, if you haven't noticed, all look and act like them as well. And, and then I'm on the phone with, we've got to use these forms. We've got to do it this way. Why? Because it's, right. And, I have gotten on the phone with barters, and I'm like, the NVCA forms are destroying the planet, and They don't really know how to respond to that. It's kind of fun. At any rate, you have, you can have dual class, where you have a separate class of stock that exists through, but that stock is held by a perpetual purpose trust. And then the trustees, you can have an agreement, and the trustees can make the determination. The trustees can be, your white VC and his friends, or the trustees can build in diversity, can have employee, can have all kinds of representation in terms of, by contract, the decisions they make. And that class of stock can say, okay, you can or you can't. You have to adhere to the mission, or you can't. It can be a positive or negative stream. So the Perpetual Purpose Trust, you also have, which has not been used as much, having a public charity on the side. So there are a couple examples I can't give because this is going to be broadcast. The good example I can give is like Flexport. If you are a for-profit and you want to do really high impact, low margin work, a foundation is always going to be red on your balance sheet. You give it away, you feel good, the whole 1%, again, that is killing the planet just as much as the technology. So let's get out of that model and instead have a public charity on the side. And what that can do, there's no limit, because that public charity can buy the good or service and then and sell it at cost. So Flexport has become the #1 provider of logistics services to disaster areas. They could never have done that giving it away. They can do it because they're doing it through a public charity sidecar. So it's just, this is, when you ask me, there are solutions, legal structural scaffolding solutions that actually work. And I'm just amazed, because we've been doing this now for 20 years. So we've proved it. We've like trial and error, but still you have the ecosystem, which is, the Andreessen Manifesto, that you've got to grow up and scale and use these forms and use this scaffolding and go in one direction, which by definition does not consider workers, does not consider the ocean that is going to be on fire, does not consider all of these other factors.
Yeah. I feel like I also know, like, a lot of this boils down to ownership and governance as like two categories that we're talking about all of these different kinds of tools. I also am curious, like, what would we call, like, if we were naming this? Because I've heard this term like new capital stack, but we're talking about even more than just capital. We're talking about actual like legal structures that are around the business. Like, I'm like, what is this body? I'm like, is there a term that you would call this? Like
I'm the person who drafted the first of the corporate court forms and called it the Flexible Purpose Corporation.
Okay.
So like, I should never be in charge of naming anything. Just to be clear, like, you know, it got absolutely no traction. I mean, somebody else needs to brand this somehow.
Like
somebody who is really creative.
Yeah, we're like
and,
in the conversations and everyone's like, yeah, and this and this and this and this. And we're like, but what do we call it? And I think it just even speaks to how niche a lot of these conversations, and it feels like this work is in such the big, like where the center of gravity is always going towards what Sue's just named. And we're like, we don't even have like a name really for this. We're working on it. We just know we want more inclusive economies. We know that we want more options. We know that we want to move beyond growth. And so, yeah, like I'm very...
I'm going to throw out accountable capitalism. I'm just going to
Accountable
throw that out there.
capitalism.
I like that.
I don't know what it is, but I want it to be different.
We don't have time to move beyond. We don't have time to throw out capitalism altogether. We don't have to. We just don't have time.
We definitely have to
but
like
we
transition
have to shift it.
into.
Like we have to.
Yeah.
Yes, we have to take. This is how capital flows now, and we need to shift how it's flowing through each of these, and then how it how it impacts the development of the tech and the workers and everybody's involved.
I feel strongly. I agree. Right. Yeah. So when we first met, I fell in love because I felt like your work was so familiar, but just 90 degrees shifted from my own, right? Orthogonal, but additive in an interesting way, because so much of my work is trying to explain to institutional investors, these asset owners, the cost of their decision-making down the line.
Yes.
And it feels very incremental, right? Even if my clients are some of the biggest VC funds around, still just like 10 billion, 20 billion. And it's adding up, but not nearly to the size that we need to sort of change the ship.
Yeah.
What I love about reimagining capitalism is it gives you a sense of like hope and purposefulness that is very open and very bright. But I agree with Suze, we don't have time for it. So we need to come up with new funding mechanisms to really lower the cost of capital for the technology that we want. And the only way to do that, I fear, is to educate people on how badly the current system isn't working and just how incremental some of the marginal structural stuff that you and I are doing really is. I feel like it's only through understanding just how urgent the situation is that we can unlock massively new amounts of capital. But one of the reasons why I'm struggling with one phrase for all of what we're describing is because we're kind of talking about a big menu of operations, right? Both in terms of like accounting, legal, and actual financial docs. And then we are talking about this across a lot of different issues. We've covered climate, we've covered labor rights, we've covered, right, like intellectual property. And it's not going to be one funds that can do all of this. But I think that the funds I saw, the sparkles in your eye the first time we met, was around really lowering the cost of capital for the technology that we do want, while folk, perhaps Susan and I, are trying to figure out how to price in more correctly the technology that mainstream finance is always going to want to support, right?
Yeah. I mean, I hear a lot in what you're saying too. Like one thing I hear is also this, like just the general play of like creating that outside pressure. Like one in everyone else, like kind of coming and having that be a part of the conversation. I think it does create a certain amount of leverage for folks like you who then can get into the room with these LPs and like try to help them understand a different way to make the money move. I think it's really funny to use the word incremental because for some reason, like my like civil rights brain like comes on and I'm like, I don't like incremental, but I feel like in the context of what you are saying and you're talking about incremental progress, incremental progress with, big like capital funds where you mentioned like 10 billion, 20 billion, that also sounds like a fuck ton of money. So, I mean, like, I'll take what we can get, like 20 billion at a time, if it's getting allocated to more diverse fund managers and it's being more accountable to these other factors aside from, returns, I think is still definitely a win. And also, as we were kind of talking about earlier, like many different angles at attacking the problem. And I would say for me, like a lot of it comes down to this idea that we don't have to wait for all of these other players to believe something different or to do something different to just start doing something different with those of us who do kind of believe that there can be something better. And I think that it's important for us to also be kind of creating that counterweight, right? Like I think that ultimately these different types of options and choices that we're talking about, especially coupled with, you know, shifting narratives and people's perception and understanding of what's possible, like if it goes anything similar to other work that I've done in the past, even when I just think about zebras, and I feel like in the very beginning, like Mata and Astrid and Jen and I were like the crazy people in the town square that were like, we need more than venture capital. And they're like, whatever, you're just better. And then like today, I feel like every day now there's like someone that's like talking on, but what if there was more than venture capital? And I'm like, wouldn't that be novel 5 years later? So yeah, like, and I'm curious too, Christie, like how have you seen conversations shift even in VC circles?
Even just last week, there was a conference and I was speaking with a emerging manager, a GP, and we were reflecting on the resources that are available today, that there is momentum, especially in the early stage space for underrepresented fund managers, and there's so much more opportunity for underrepresented founders to get access to capital at the pre-seed stage and at the seed stage. There is, though, a cliff. And I think that cliff falls at around Series A. And now we know that there's this pullback, or as you said, shriveling of capital available. And so unfortunately, I think that what's happening at the macro level is really will really put the brakes on a lot of the momentum that we have seen.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, is that the momentum, I think, is similar to what you did with the Dazzle or with Zebra.
Yes.
The momentum was there for many folks to get their foot in the door. And now the door is closing slightly again. And I think this comes back to what you're saying about 10 billion, 20 billion, which sounds like a fuck ton of money.
It does.
But when you think about the asset class, it's a small sliver of money. And then when you think about the fact that VC is a sliver of another asset class, now we can really start to appreciate how this one sector has outsized change in our society.
Yeah.
Huge multiplicative effect.
Yes.
It's shocking to me how quickly this space lives, right? My husband, who is a climate venture capitalist, and I joke all the time, like, why do we choose to live in San Francisco and pay these like property taxes? We are living in the Roman Empire. This is Rome. I would be thrilled to live in Buenos Aires, but you live in Silicon Valley if you want to be in this game, I think, because if you can change one person's mind over a dinner party, you can actually have really interesting impacts. I have seen, right, for the last couple of years, this confusion around the gig economy. Oh, Deliveroo's IPO didn't go so great in the UK. Institutional investors didn't like it. Do we actually believe that Instacart's IPO should be at $30 billion or $10 billion? And just last week, Letitia James did an amazing thing in New York State where she's gotten a over $300 million settlement fund for Uber and Lyft drivers, only in the New York State, right? And got them sick days, got them benefits. Where did this all come from? This came from Uber here in the Bay Area, not having a very diverse cap table, not having a very diverse set of initial employees, with the exception of Mitch Kapor, who said very early on that there were certain behaviors and cultural norms that he wasn't comfortable with, pulled himself off the board in 2017.
Right, I remember that.
Did it take us that long to think through what labor rights should be like for a business like that? So it is shocking to me that we still haven't figured it out.
I think the thing is that there were people speaking very loudly at that time. 2012.
But they didn't have money.
You mentioned Ellen's case.
Ellen Powell.
Yes, with Kleiner
Perkins.
Perkins. That was back in 2014, 2015.
2013, yeah.
Yes. So we have had people raising the flag for many years now at this point. And I think the thing is that the settlement fund is a win, but it's still a situation where labor overall was devalued. So was there wealth generated with Uber? Yes. Where was that wealth extracted from? The worker. And when we think about venture capital,
in two ways: the actual driver themselves, and then I would say the union that backed it as well, right? Because cheap VC money enabled all of those gig models to grow.
Exactly. Cheap VC money, which then those profits were not taxed. And when we think about the system as a whole, tech exists in a society led by a government. And so what could happen instead? Could we have protections for labor? And could VCs, when they're diligencing a deal, instead of just thinking about the total addressable market, or the progressive VCs who think about the impact their investment could make at scale, think about the harm that their investment could do at scale? And if their investment did generate value, is it new value or was it extracted from an existing party
And from whom and priced out? Yeah, that's so interesting.
And if I could just add one thing on the hope side and pull it back to Coraline.
Yes.
So I don't think we have to change all the hearts and minds. I think back to the civil rights, back to incentives. If we can take advantage of the lemming approach. I mean, VCs get excited about one thing, and they all move in a direction. Private equity, the same. Every part of the capital stack, and companies. And so what we saw, I was a founding board member of SASB and then advised TCFD. And if I can go to the climate world, really, we just had to get, I mean, we haven't talked about accounting. Accounting is another huge lever. But if you can get a leader to do something fundamentally and structurally different in an industry vertical, what happens just naturally, then if it's material, they report it. Then the young little lawyers and accountants and all of the other, they're like, okay, in semiconductors, they review everything that, X company is doing it differently. TCFD, in terms of doing climate risk analysis, from the guidelines coming out to everybody doing it, was only about 2 years. And it was a really smart approach at going to the leaders. And I also think going to the leaders, getting a couple to use the license. And then, oh my God, and then and then the investors, when they're investing, but everybody else is using it. It's the Hippocratic license, yes. So, and then it becomes
FOMO.
Yeah, it becomes more standardized. So I think you can have, if it is an organized movement where you go after, and I'll just give you one example. One of my co-chair of my group, and I think there were 7 other lawyers at big firms, decided there is a questionnaire before a company goes public. And they realized that there were no questions as to whether the board had gay and lesbian and LGBTQ representation. And they all just decided to change it unilaterally. And then the big firms all had changed that. Everybody else changed the questionnaire. And all of a sudden, every questionnaire for every company that was going public. What are you doing with workers? You can do that. There's certain levers. All of a sudden, kind of everybody gets part of it.
What we're hearing, and I think this is so interesting because these issues are not going to be fixed by government alone, is, and to sort of draw on your climate parallel, TCFD was all about like voluntary industry ratcheting, right?
Remind me what
TCFD is. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So we're talking about climate risk in financial statements. It's not really very sexy.
Got it.
But it is really, really important. But there's no reason you couldn't use
like
that approach.
Like in an 8K type of...
And all of
accountability-focused capitalism, right? It was all about the market holding each other accountable. Oh, everyone wants to do best practices. Oh, Larry Fink, BlackRock, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then science-based targets came in. SBTI came in to actually say directionally you're supposed to be here, right? But there was a really fun miasma period for the market to say, okay, let's all just do our best. Let's all make big commitments. Let's all figure out what it means to decarbonize before we buy offsets. And we still haven't gotten to real regulation, right? Mm-hmm. California and Newsom just had like a little step forward in terms of carbon accounting, right? But my point being, regulation is not going to be here in time to save us, particularly on things that move as quickly as AI. And we actually have a roadmap that works around how do you get the industry to compete with each other on this thing? How do we make it sexy so that you have, and I'm not holding it up as, perfect, but KKR's movement, TPG Rise, right? And this all started because Elevar Equity was making a ton of money investing in telco in India, right? And now you have something where you actually have ownership works and you're actually trying to give employees a little bit of equity. Not perfect, but it's moving a lot faster than government.
So I'm hearing a little bit of hope here, and I'm gonna wrap us up because I'm gonna try to tie this thought in and then give you guys one last prompt, which is that if we one of the things some of the choices that some players including some of the work that Coraline's doing in open source, putting Hippocratic licenses on, that type of thing that can get adopted and picked up pretty easily, and influencing people. Like if we can move people, like that cultural sort of piece, especially as we talk about the kind of lemming heat seeker energy that very much exists in this industry, like the culture can shift like faster than regulation, and that could at least buy us some time until we get it written down on paper. So finally, I would love to go around. I'm going to start with you, Shu Dar, and I would love for you guys to just like give us one call to action. Like if our VC, LP, pension fund, whoever, institutional investor counterparts were watching this video, what's one call to action that you have for them as we go around?
Well, AGM season is coming up. So if you haven't talked about the issue that you care about there, just ask for basic disclosure, because accountability is important, but before you actually get there, just a little transparency.
All right.
So we're about a year out from an election, a presidential election. I would ask that you start paying attention. And I would also say, don't underestimate the power of your voice, especially those of you in the investor seat, because you sit at a nexus of influence and power that really has an outsized impact on our society.
I'm going to be really simple and say, let's work to end the era of the cult of personality.
As leaders?
As leaders.
Okay. Suze.
Yeah.
She's like co-signing
what she said. Yeah, I would just say, and one of the reasons I'm so excited to be part of this conversation is I don't view myself as a tech lawyer. I've really been focusing on climate, and technology has an impact on climate, but not nearly as much as transportation and ag and energy. But there are tools that we have been using now for 20 years that really, really work. And what I don't want to see is a bunch of whole tech bros who see this issue and, then come up with new solutions. There is room for more iteration. But a lot of them we can say, well, we've tried that at scale and it hasn't worked, and we'll tell you exactly why. So let's not start from a blank slate, but let's use these tools because they can work and they're really, really needed. But I go back to the cult of personality.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a really, really awesome discussion. Thank you so much, ladies. It's been really great to have you. I cannot wait to talk more offline. And we'll make sure that when we share this video, we will also make sure that we can share ways for folks who might want to follow up with questions and to learn more to do so. So thank you.